Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Faith and Focus podcast, your go-to guide for smashing the AQA GCSE Religious Studies exam. I'm Laura, and in today's episode we're diving into one of the most practical and relevant parts of the Christian Practices Unit, the role of the church in the local and worldwide community. Here's what's coming up. So number 1, what the church does in local communities, food banks and street pastors. Number 2, the global mission of the church, evangelism and church growth. Number 3, how the worldwide church works for peace, justice and reconciliation. Number 4, a worked 12-mark question with model answer using AQA. 5, a revision strategy using spaced retrieval to lock in what you've learned. Let's get started. Segment 1, the role of the church in the local community. So for lots of Christians, the church isn't just a place to worship on Sundays. It's actually the foundation of the local community. So let's look at 2 key examples that you're going to need to know for the exam. So number 1, you need to know about food banks. One of the ways that the church helps the local community is food banks. Now these have obviously increased in popularity in recent times because of cost of living crisis and austerity, etc., etc. So churches often organise or support food banks that offer emergency food parcels, toiletries and support for people in crisis. And one major Christian charity that you need to be aware of that deals with this is the Trussell Trust. So this operates about 1,200 food banks across the UK, and they base their work on Christian values of compassion and dignity. So food banks reflect Christian duty to help the poor and hungry and demonstrate agape, which is selfless, unconditional love, i.e. the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated by dying on the cross. So a religious teaching that you can use to support the idea of food banks is Matthew chapter 25 verse 35, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat." And then another aspect of church in the local community that you guys need to be aware of is street pastors. So street pastors are trained Christian volunteers that go out at night to keep an eye on people and watch out for anybody that might be in need of help. That's especially usually in nightlife hotspots. So any town or city centre where there's lots of clubbing or bars or, without being rude, drunk people, right? They are, street pastors are trained and they keep a watch out for people that might end up getting into a potentially tricky situation. Things that they offer, so they can offer bottles of water or flip-flops, ladies and gentlemen. Potentially, we all know that if we wear high heels on a night out, our feet start to hurt. Okay, so street pastors are there with flip-flops to make sure that you're not walking around in bare feet, risking like cutting your feet or whatever. They also offer first aid if you need it. They can offer a listening ear if you need it. Sometimes things happen on nights out that we get upset about and we need to maybe just talk to somebody about it to calm down. And then they offer help for vulnerable or intoxicated people. So if they see somebody that is clearly alone but very drunk, then they will intervene to try and help that person and make sure that they stay safe. So street pastors are about showing God's love in action. So it's not just knowing the teachings of love thy neighbour, but actually acting on those teachings. Quote from the Bible that you can use to support that is James chapter 2 verse 17. "Faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead." So a key point for the exam, those examples show that the church takes the teachings of Jesus seriously. So when Jesus says, feed the hungry, look after each other, serve each other, care for the poor, all of those things that he teaches, those are examples of that being lived out by Christians. Okay, segment 2 then. Let's look at mission, evangelism and church growth. So this is more of the church's outward facing role to the world. So street pastors and food banks are like inward looking in your local community, in your local environment, in your country. Mission, evangelism and church growth is more of an outward facing role. It's about spreading the Christian faith. So the first idea then is mission. So mission comes from the Latin missio, which means to send. And Christians believe that they are sent into the world to share the gospel, which is obviously the message of Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, etc., etc. So this might involve going abroad and sharing the gospel, sometimes called overseas missions or people being missionaries, supporting church communities in remote or hostile regions, and living out the gospel through action and service. Part of mission and evangelism and church growth, obviously through history, missionaries and the Christian church have been quite aggressive at spreading Christianity in communities, certainly in places like India, Africa, amongst Native American cultures. So it's quite important that whilst this has problems in history, mission and evangelism are not inherently bad in of themselves, so just bear that in mind. Something that you can use to support the idea of mission is Matthew chapter 28 verses 19 to 20, which we've used before. It's the Great Commission. So it's that idea where Jesus says to his disciples, "Go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you." Evangelism then. So evangelism is the active spreading of the Christian message, with the aim usually to convert people to Christianity. Again, going back in history, active evangelism is something that we definitely did during the spread of the British Empire, especially during Victorian times as well. But it's kind of got a different face now. So modern evangelism is things like the Alpha course. So people that are curious about Christianity but might want to investigate it before they commit to going to church, they can do something called the Alpha course. Youth ministries and Christian festivals are a really good idea and a really good way of getting people involved in evangelism. Social media campaigns and digital evangelism, that's obviously something that's fairly new relative to the history of the world and the history of Christianity, but certainly something that's becoming ever more important. And then just simple one-on-one conversations are sometimes a way of spreading Christianity to others as well. So the ultimate goal of evangelism is to grow the church. So to grow the numbers of people who consider themselves to be Christians. So in the UK, we've had a period where church attendance has been on the decline in the 20th century for definite, going into the 21st century. However, there is evidence that younger people, so Gen Z, if you like, and younger, that they are actually turning back to church attendance. So it will be interesting to see whether that's something that's on the rise. But it might be worth mentioning that in your exam because that shows that you're aware of current events. But the overall trend has been declining in this country. But in other countries, particularly South America, Africa and Asia, obviously being continents, not countries, but Christianity is really growing quite rapidly in those countries. And it's evangelical Christian groups that are tending to do that spreading of the church mission. So just something to consider. And it's also something to consider that if you are an evangelical Christian in particular, the clue's in the title, that evangelism is a central duty. So spreading that message of salvation to everyone is like a fundamental cornerstone of your belief. Okay, segment 3. So worldwide mission of the church. We're looking at reconciliation, persecution, and charitable work. So we've kind of looked at local church, food banks and street pastors. We've looked at a more outward-facing idea of the church, which is mission and evangelism. And now we're looking at the worldwide mission. So how does the global Christian church take centre stage? The first thing that they do is promoting peace and reconciliation. So it's 2025 and we've just had the death of one pope, Pope Francis, and the confirming of another pope, Pope Leo the 14th, I think. And one of the first things that he said as pope is that he wants there to be reconciliation and no war and things like that. So one of his fundamental messages for the world is about reconciliation. So it's a key role for the church is peace and reconciliation. So that is about trying to restore relationships where there's division or conflict. Now, obviously, in the world at the moment, there is a lot of conflict. One example of a group that tries to promote peace and reconciliation is the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland. Now, that is based in the idea of that division that there has been for hundreds of years between Catholic and Protestant communities in Ireland. They want to try and promote dialogue, they want to heal those divisions, they want to build peace, and they want to build understanding, because nobody wants to be at war. And some of the things that happened with like the Troubles in Ireland, IRA, everything that happened before the Good Friday Agreement, that is something that we don't particularly want to go back to. So the Corrymeela community worked really hard to try and keep those bonds strengthened. And if you want a religious teaching to support that idea, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 18, God reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So this reflects Christian belief that forgiveness and peace are core to the gospel message. So Jesus dying on the cross forgave our sins, we reconciled ourselves to God by that action, and then we are therefore tasked with doing the same for others, even if they're not Christian. Okay, another aspect of the worldwide church then is responding to persecution. So if they cannot get peace and reconciliation, then obviously Christians want to help those people that might be suffering because of their faith. There are lots of places in the world where it is dangerous to be a Christian. So the worldwide church wants to support that by raising awareness. So they have events and things, and people like the Pope or Archbishop of Canterbury or whatever, they will use their platform as the leader of the church or the important people within the church to kind of raise awareness of the issues that there are. They will offer prayer, aid and legal support. So there are businesses, there are charities that work to try and support people who are in need. And obviously, an obvious one is encouraging forgiveness and perseverance. So there are instances where people get things wrong, but we should be promoting this idea of forgiving each other. God did that for us. Jesus did that for us. So if we consider ourselves to be Christians, we should be modelling that behaviour, really. So a religious teaching to support that idea is Romans 12:14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. You could also use the Beatitudes as well. Blessed are the persecuted. You could use that. Another way that they try and help is charitable work. So this is where you need to look at Christian development charities. So you need to make sure that you are aware, ideally, of 2 of these. CAFOD being the obvious one, and then one of either Christian Aid or the Tearfund. They're all very similar. CAFOD is the biggest one. And then other ones, Christian Aid or Tearfund, you hopefully will have looked at those in your lessons. So CAFOD is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, and they work across the world in more than 40 countries, and the things that they do vary from providing a room so that kids can go to school in other countries, to providing disaster relief for like hurricanes and floods, and to talking to governments to try and change things at a policy level. So there are all different things that people do in CAFOD. So they follow the belief of love your neighbour as yourself. That is literally the centre of their teaching. It's based in Catholic and Christian fundamental beliefs. And their work is Christianity in action. So it's looking at the physical needs, because if you've been in a flood and you've got nowhere to live, you need some shelter or first aid or whatever. But it's also looking at spiritual needs, like those people in those communities need spiritual support as well as physical support, and CAFOD and other agencies try to do that. So you need to be able to, for the exam, give a named example and explain how their work reflects Christian teachings on justice, compassion and global responsibility. Okay, segment 4 then let's look at a model answer. So I tried to look at a 12-mark question. And so the 12-mark question statement is, the church should focus more on helping people locally than overseas. So this is getting you to try and compare the different aspects of the church. So you've got local church, outward-looking church, and then worldwide church. So you're trying to evaluate which one of these, if any, is better than the other or not. So our model answer then. So some Christians argue that the church should focus on its local community because it is best placed to respond to the immediate and visible needs of those nearby. Churches know their area, the specific challenges people face, such as poverty, isolation or addiction, and can act quickly and appropriately. A good example is the Trussell Trust, which operates food banks in partnership with local churches. These food banks provide emergency aid for families in crisis. Similarly, Street Pastors offers practical help, support and prayer to people on the streets late at night, especially vulnerable or intoxicated individuals. These initiatives show Christian love in action. James 2:17 says, "Faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead." This verse highlights the idea that Christians must demonstrate their faith through good works, especially in their local community where the need is visible and urgent. However, many Christians believe that the church has a universal responsibility to help anyone in need, no matter where they live. This includes responding to issues like global poverty, natural disasters and war. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, Jesus teaches that love for your neighbour should extend beyond your immediate community, even to strangers or those from different backgrounds. The message is clear: Christians should show compassion universally. Charities like CAFOD, Christian Aid and Tearfund work in countries affected by famine, conflict and climate change. Their Christian motivation is to serve the poorest and most vulnerable globally, following the command in Mark 12:31 to love your neighbour as yourself. While helping locally is important, Christianity teaches that all human beings are made in God's image. Limiting support to one's own country may neglect the global nature of Christian love and compassion. Helping overseas reflects the inclusive and universal mission of the church. So you've got argument, counter-argument, and a mini-evaluation there. So argument 2. Another reason to focus locally is that it strengthens the church itself. By working together to tackle issues like homelessness or mental health in their neighbourhoods, Christians build stronger church communities. This leads to deeper relationships, more active faith, and a greater sense of purpose. Local outreach also supports evangelism. When churches serve their neighbourhood well, people notice and may be drawn to explore Christianity. Projects like youth clubs, support groups and community cafes are effective ways of living out the gospel and growing the church. Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 5 verses 14 to 16 that Christians are the light of the world and should let their good deeds shine before others. This suggests that local action can be a form of public witness. On the other hand, many global issues are so severe that overseas aid may save more lives. For example, in areas struck by drought or civil war, people may be at risk of death from hunger or violence. Here, the urgency and scale of need far outweigh what many local communities face. Organisations also work in countries where Christians are persecuted. Without international support, these Christians may be imprisoned or killed. Providing for them upholds the belief in the unity of the church, the idea that all Christians are one body in Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 12 to 27. Jesus' final instruction in the Great Commission, Matthew 28:19, was to go and make disciples of all nations. This command shows that Christianity is not limited to national boundaries. Serving overseas is part of the church's mission to bring the gospel to everyone and to care for them practically as well as spiritually. So again, we've done another argument, counter-argument and a little evaluation. Now let's go for the conclusion. So in conclusion, while there are strong arguments on both sides, the best response is not to choose one over the other. The church should serve where there is the greatest need, whether locally or globally. Jesus showed love to individuals nearby and to outsiders alike. A healthy church should follow this model, serving its immediate community while also supporting global initiatives through prayer, financial aid and mission. In the exam, it's important to show that you've got this idea of balanced judgment and support it with specific Christian teachings and examples. That's going to get you into those higher level marks. Now, obviously, you may not have time to do as much detail as that. This is just an example of like the best model that you can have to make sure that you've got the best examples to work from. Okay, segment 5 is revision technique. So this is the idea of spaced retrieval. So this is a 2-3-5-7 rule. Now obviously this might be a little bit useless at this point if you are very close to your exam. However, it is something that you can use for all revision for all exams. So don't necessarily use this specifically for religious studies. You can use this for anything. So spaced retrieval. So day 0, you learn the topic. So that might be something that you learn in the lesson. Day 2, so 2 days later, do a little mini recall quiz or write out a mind map. That just keeps that learning in your brain. Day 5, try and do the 12-mark question, but without notes. Day 10, teach that topic to someone else or quiz yourself with flashcards. Day 17, combine all notes, quotes and examples into a 1-page revision sheet. So by spacing your revision and testing yourself as you go along, you're not trying to cram all that information in at the end and try and remember it all at the end. So you're moving your knowledge from short-term memory into long-term recall, and that's what you need to do to make sure that by the time you get to your exams, that you can actually remember things that you learnt way back in year 10. Okay, so tip. This might be something you can start now for other exams. So start a revision calendar with spaced retrieval slots built in. Make sure that the things that you're doing the most spaced retrieval on are the things that you find the most difficult. It's no point going over the things that you already know and leaving the things that you don't. Okay, that's all for today's episode of the Faith and Focus podcast. So we've covered what the church does locally, food banks and street pastors. We've looked at evangelism, mission and church growth. We've looked at the global mission of the Church of reconciliation and responding to persecution. We've briefly looked at the work of Christian charities like CAFOD, Christian Aid and Tearfund. We've gone through a 12-mark model answer using the AQA GCSE structure, and we've got a revision technique and the 2-3-5-7 space retrieval method. So in our next episode, we are going to look at Buddhism beliefs and teachings. We'll then move on to Buddhist practices, and we'll then move on to the themes papers, starting with theme A. Obviously, we have interrupted the flow. I should have been doing Buddhism this time, but I realised that I'd forgotten to do this particular section of the Christianity paper. So we will be moving on to Buddhism next. So don't forget to subscribe, share this episode, and follow me on @Faith and Focus Podcast on Instagram for more revision tips and resources. And until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep learning. Bye!